The city breathed heavy air. The gray sky, blurred by the constant smog, hung over the streets like a forgotten but pressing threat. No one could remember the last time the sun had shone here, and few paid attention. Dirty buildings with crumbling plaster stretched along the narrow streets, where the smell of decay mingled with the smoke of burning garbage cans. The sound of sirens and shouting, the hum of police cars. These sounds had long ago become the background, part of an invisible but tangible knot in which the lives of all the townspeople were tied. At the intersection, where the paint on the crosswalks had long since worn off, a girl moved slowly. Her slender fingers gripped the worn handles of her wheelchair, the creak of which echoed through the empty alleys. There was no expression on her face, only impassive concentration. Her name was Zoe. She was only 14, but life had long ago taught her not to rely on compassion. Zoe knew every cracking brick in this town. Her home was an old dilapidated driveway where water was more rust than liquid. She grew up surrounded by people who had forgotten what dreams were. Every day for Zoe was a struggle for something simple, for food, for a place to sleep, for the right not to disappear into the shadows that consumed many before her. But the city gave her no respite, and this day had been especially hard. Her tire was stuck in a crack in the sidewalk, and she tried in vain to get it out. People passing by averted their eyes. No one wanted to get involved. She finally broke free of the trap and moved on, ignoring the pain in her hands. But the shadow that covered her didn't disappear, not even when the sun was long gone. It was Sergeant Warren. His figure, massive and menacing, was as if it had been designed to throw men to their knees. His eyes read absolute power and contempt. He was the king of these dirty streets, the king of fear and impunity. And today he had chosen Zoe. "What? Are you loitering around again?" His voice was as cold as morning frost and filled with boredom, as if he'd just decided that the next victim of his attention didn't deserve more. "Come on, show me what you're hiding." Zoe was silent. She knew it wouldn't change anything. Warren loved her silence like a hunter loves his prey's plea for mercy. His boots slammed roughly into her chair, making it rock. "I said, show me." He leaned closer, the smell of tobacco and cheap beer burning her nostrils. Zoe looked up, and for the first time in a long time she felt real fear. But not fear for her life. Number. She was afraid for what lay ahead, afraid of what would happen next if she broke, and she wasn't going to break. Not here, not now. At that moment, a thought flashed through her mind, that if no one would come to the rescue, perhaps she should be the one who would one day put an end to it. In a city full of shadows, her silhouette was a faint but persistent light. She knew this night would change everything. Zoe rolled back to avoid Warren's boot, which once again slid menacingly over the edge of her wheelchair. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her face unfazed. She knew. People like him loved to see fear, fed on it like predators who sense the weakness of prey. "You got a tongue, huh? Or was it your idea to sneak another package onto my streets?" He grinned, bending over so that his face was dangerously close to hers. "You think, if you have wheels instead of legs, you can't be trouble? You think I don't know people like you?" His words cut deeper than she expected, but Zoe clenched her teeth. She knew it was best not to speak in these situations. A word against someone like that was tantamount to signing a death warrant. "Black, crippled, and probably a thief," he continued, looking her over from top to bottom. "Let's see what you're carrying around." His hands roughly grasped the bag that hung on the arm of the chair. Zoe instinctively reached for it, but was unable to fight Warren's strength. He pulled out several old books, shabby but obviously carefully stored. "What's all this shit?" "Books? What are you, a reader now? Look at you, Madam Scientist." He picked up one of the books as if it were contagious and threw it on the ground, right into the dirt. Zoe could hardly hold back her tears. These books were her salvation, her refuge from the horror of the real world. But she knew that to show pain was to lose. "Pick it up," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. Warren froze for a moment and then burst into laughter, coarse, loud, filled with contempt. "You said what? Lift? Are you out of your mind? Or is that your wheelchair doing your thinking for you?" He shoved her forward roughly, and the chair nearly tipped over. "Next time, baby, pray you're not even on these streets." But it was at that moment that Zoe noticed something in the distance. Across the street, around the corner of an abandoned house, the man who had just tried to escape from the police was slumped against the wall. His hands were raised and his eyes were begging for mercy. 3 other policemen stood around him, but their uniforms looked dirty, unrepresentative, as if they were more gangsters than representatives of the law. "Are you still here?" Warren noticed her gaze and followed her eyes. "It's none of your business." But she couldn't get away. One of the policemen took out a baton and without saying a word, hit the man on the stomach. He bent, fell to his knees, but tried to whisper something. "We're not playing with babies here," one of them shouted, throwing another punch. Warren stepped toward Zoe and grabbed her shoulder roughly, forcing her to look him in the eye. "You didn't see anything. Do you understand?" His voice was low, threatening. "Nobody listens to people like you, and if you ever decide to tell anyone, remember, your wheelchair won't save you." He leaned closer so that his words burned her skin like acid. "If I were you, I'd pray we never cross paths again." He let her go, and she was left sitting in the chair, feeling the world around her shrink. She had seen more than she should have. She knew more than she could afford to know. But in that moment, her heart was filled not only with fear, but with a strange determination. Zoe looked at the book lying in the dirt and slowly bent down to pick it up. Her fingers touched the ragged cover, and she swore to herself that this humiliation would not be the last word in her story. Zoe tried to move as fast as her weak arms and the worn wheels of the chair would allow. Every now and then she looked over her shoulder, though she knew it was pointless. If Warren thought she was his target, no amount of speed would save her. It had been 2 days since their first encounter, but the shadow of that man haunted her relentlessly. She saw his car parked on the corner of her street. She saw him smoking lazily, pretending not to notice her, but his gaze said otherwise. It was the look of a man who enjoyed the hunt. On the 3rd day, he talked to her neighbors. "Do you know this girl?" he asked with exaggerated carelessness. "Small, in a stroller, seems to be involved with a couple of bad guys. Better stay away from her. You never know where they end up." The gossip spread instantly. Neighbors started averting their eyes as Zoe walked by. Some whispered behind her back. Some just slammed the door shut when she tried to knock. Her name quickly became a curse that no one wanted to get their hands dirty with. When she tried to seek help, the doors were closed in front of her. A local human rights organization told her that they had no resources for individual cases. A homeless shelter averted its eyes and told her dryly that her place had already been given to another family. Even her friends began to avoid her, fearing Warren's wrath. But that was just the beginning. One night, as she was walking home through a dark alleyway, she was surrounded by several young men. They were behaving noisily, clearly under the influence of alcohol. One of them leaned toward her, teeth shining in a grin. "I hear you've decided to play heroin." He reached out, grabbing her chair and rocking it slightly. "You shouldn't have gone where you weren't wanted." The others laughed. Someone kicked her chair, and it rolled backwards. She clung to the arms, trying to keep her balance as they continued their abuse. "You know who's in charge, don't you?" the other one asked. "Warren clearly told you to be quiet." "So I'll help her." One of them suddenly shouted and grabbed her bag. She tried to yank it back, but they were stronger. Books flew out onto the ground, scattering into muddy puddles. Her little notebook, where she'd been taking notes on what she'd seen, ended up in their hands. They opened it, looked at each other, and laughed. "What is she, a spy or something? Look, Warren's gonna love this." One of them tore off a page and threw it at her feet. When they left, Zoe was left sitting in the dark, shivering and clutching the rest of her belongings. She didn't cry. The tears had long since dried up. Instead, she looked up at the dark sky, where no stars were visible, and thought, "How low can this city go?" But even at that point, she didn't give up. In the morning, she found ways to recover the records and continued to keep them. She wrote down everything: what she heard, what she saw, even what others were afraid to say out loud. She had a goal: not to let this darkness consume her. On the fourth day, Warren came to her house. He stood in front of the door, looking at her with a smirk. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he said, tapping his baton lazily on his palm. "You think anybody's going to believe you? You, a little black girl on wheels? This town belongs to me. People here listen to me, not people like you." Zoe was silent, feeling his every phrase turn to poison slowly coursing through her veins. "Last chance," he whispered, leaning in so close she could see every drop of sweat on his face. "Shut up, or I'll personally make sure you never open your mouth again." He walked away, leaving her in the emptiness of his words. But something clicked in Zoe's soul. Not fear, number anger. In that moment, she realized her enemy wasn't just Warren, but the entire town that allowed men like him to rule. And she decided she would go all the way, even if she had to break the system to do it. Every night, the city became more dangerous for Zoe. She could no longer just go out on the street like she used to. Passers-by turned away, neighbors were nowhere to be seen, and police cars patrolled her neighborhood with frightening regularity, as if they were hunting her specifically. She knew Warren wouldn't stop until he broke her. On the fifth day after their last meeting, she heard someone knocking on her door. It wasn't just loud, it was as threatening as a hammer. She froze in her chair, afraid to breathe. "I know you're in there," came Warren's voice. "Don't make me break down the fucking door, baby." He used an affectionate tone, but a cold threat lurked in every word. Zoe didn't move. She knew that if he came in, nothing good would happen. "Let me guess," he continued, listening. "You think you can just hide? But I see you. Do you hear me? You're like an open book to me." He was silent, but the silence was even more frightening. After a moment, there was a rumble, as if he'd thrown something at the door. "Okay," he said, stepping away. "I'll see you later. But trust me, the next time we meet, you'll wish you hadn't opened it." Zoe heard his footsteps moving away. She rolled cautiously to the door and looked through the peephole. There was a crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor. She didn't want to pick it up, but something in her chest pushed her forward. As she unfolded the paper, she saw a photograph, a picture of herself in an armchair, obviously taken recently. On the back was written, "I'm always here for you." Zoe didn't sleep that night. Every sound on the street made her flinch. Her mind tossed between panic and determination. She knew it would be crazy to stay here. Early in the morning, she gathered her belongings, a notebook, a few books, and clothes that fit into a small bag. She left the house without looking back. Taking shelter was harder than she thought. The homeless shelter refused her, and one of the staff members glanced at her and muttered quietly, "Better not get caught by this guy. He was already here asking about you." Zoe realized she didn't have much time. She found an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, where she took refuge in one corner, trying to keep warm under an old blanket. During the night, she heard footsteps, clattering boots, and screams echoing through the streets. It wasn't just a patrol. They were looking for her. The second night, they found her. Zoe opened her eyes abruptly when she heard the clatter of boots on the stairs. The door to her temporary shelter had been smashed open, and Warren and his 2 assistants had entered the room. They looked intimidating, their faces a blatant lust for violence. "Well, there you are," Warren said, giving her a smile that gave Zoe a chill. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" He stepped forward, leaned over, and grabbed her neck, lifting her face closer to his. "Listen to me," he hissed. "You little black rat. You think you stand a chance against us? You're nothing. Even this town, which is rotten enough as it is, wouldn't notice if you just disappeared." Zoe tried to resist, but his grip was too strong. Her body wouldn't obey her, but her eyes burned. Her gaze was full of a fury and determination that seemed to surprise even him. "You won't break me," she wheezed despite the pain in her throat. He released her abruptly, and she fell back into the chair. He stood up, wiping his hands as if touching her had defiled him. "You want to play hero, don't you?" he asked, looking her over. "Then I'll show you what happens to people like you." He pulled out his baton and slammed it into the wheel of her chair. It snapped with a crack. Another blow, and the chair fell on its side, knocking the air out of her. He watched as she tried to rise, her body arching in an unsuccessful attempt to regain her balance. "Remember this moment," he said, leaning over her. "This is just the beginning." When they left, leaving her in the cold darkness, Zoe was alone again. Her body ached, but the pain was nothing compared to the hatred that flared inside. She knew, if she didn't stop him, he would continue to sow fear and destruction. But now she realized that Warren was more than just a man. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with this town. And to defeat him, she would have to destroy the entire system. Zoe knew that silence wouldn't save her. Too many people had suffered from the likes of Warren. Too many had stayed in the shadows, afraid to speak. Her fear was different now. She was afraid of disappearing without a trace, of becoming one of those whose names no one would remember. Her voice was her only weapon, and she decided to use it. At dawn, still reeling from the beating, Zoe pulled herself together and made her way to the local newspaper. Her face was pale and her hands trembled, but she didn't let herself stop. The editor, a tired man with bags under his eyes, listened to her story as if he'd heard it many times before. "Do you realize that if we publish this, you'll be in danger?" he asked, studying her face. "I'm already in danger," she answered firmly. "But if I keep quiet, they win." The editor agreed to publish the article but warned that no names would be named. Zoe knew this was not enough, but it was a start. She also contacted a small group of activists who helped her record a video message. In it, she explicitly named Warren and his colleagues, talking about violence, threats, and systemic corruption. The video quickly went viral on social media. The response was immediate. Several organizations expressed support, and dozens of people began sharing their own stories of police abuse. It seemed like a step forward, but Zoe did not expect how quickly the system would strike back. 2 days later, a notice appeared on the main street of the neighborhood. The police were looking for Zoe Jones, suspected of theft and involvement in drug distribution. Her picture was printed in close-up with the caption, "Dangerous criminal. Be on the lookout." Zoe found out about it when she hid in the apartment of one of the activists. The room was quiet until her ally turned on the television. On the screen was her, not the person she knew herself to be, but a disfigured image created by the system. "They fabricated it," she whispered. "It's a lie." "Of course it's a lie," the activist replied, closing the curtains. "But they won't stop. You're now officially their enemy." A few hours later, the apartment door was kicked in. The police burst in screaming, pushing everyone in their way. Zoe barely had time to grab her bag and flee out the back door, but she had to leave everything else behind, including her wheelchair, which they violently smashed to pieces. She found herself on the street, defenseless, forced to crawl until she found shelter in an empty warehouse. Her hands bled from contact with the rough asphalt, but her mind was focused on one thing. She couldn't give up. The next day, a video from the police showing someone who looked like Zoe handing a bundle of drugs to another person began circulating on the internet. The video was crudely made with obvious editing errors, but most people had had enough. The comments under the video were full of hate. "That's what they do and then complain about racism. Good thing they're looking for her. I hope they put her away for good." Zoe read this, hiding in the corner of the warehouse, and felt her world crumbling. Even those who had supported her began to doubt her. But everything changed when she remembered one detail. She began to recreate her notes, reviewing everything she had left. Her memory was a sharp weapon. She recalled specific instances where Warren and his co-workers had crossed the line of the law. She knew her words might not be proof, but she decided to look for witnesses to corroborate her stories. Zoe contacted a man who had once suffered at the hands of Warren and persuaded him to come forward. He was afraid, but she said, "If we don't speak, they will destroy us. All of us. This isn't just my fight, it's ours." The next day, Zoe took to the streets despite the threat of arrest. She moved slowly but surely, gathering people around her. Those who had seen her video and knew her story started coming out of their homes. People began to demand answers. The crowd grew, and with it, her determination. Warren watched from his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He hadn't expected her to go this far. But he knew one thing now. She couldn't just be stopped with threats. She had to be destroyed. The game was escalating, and Zoe felt she was nearing a point from which there would be no return. Zoe was hiding in a cramped basement, damp and dark. The only window, taped shut with cardboard, let in the dim light of a street lamp. She had a notebook in her hands where she frantically jotted down everything she remembered about the days she'd been forced to confront Warren and his kingdom. Her thoughts flowed as fast as a river. Dates, names, streets, events. Every little detail could prove to be a clue to a massive corruption. She started with what she knew. How Warren threatened her. How he intimidated her neighbors. How he made people disappear from town. Zoe knew there was more behind those actions. She needed proof. The first step was to reestablish contact with Warren's former victims. She contacted David, an elderly man who had been kicked out of his home for allegedly breaking the law. In fact, his apartment was on a plot of land that was wanted by local developers. David was now living on the street, but the fire of justice still burned in his eyes. "They wanted to silence me," he said when Zoe explained her purpose. "But if you're ready to fight, I'm with you. I have records of who came to me with offers." These records turned out to be gold. They mentioned names, companies, and even the amount of bribes paid for the services of Warren and his team. Zoe continued to look for information. She found out that one of the bars downtown was Warren's meeting place with people who hired him to do dirty work. Taking a chance, she went there, hiding in the shadows of an alley. She watched Warren come out with some man in an expensive suit and wrote down the license plate number of his car. Her network began to expand. People who had seen Zoe's video message began to write to her, passing on information about strange events related to the police. Someone told about the mysterious disappearance of an activist who spoke out against real estate developers. Someone described how he had been forced to sign false statements. The puzzle began to take shape. But Zoe realized that information alone wasn't enough. She needed it to raise public awareness. With the help of one of her allies, she created an anonymous internet channel where she began posting the facts she had gathered. She posted documents, told people stories, and pointed out direct links between the crimes and the police. The response was instantaneous. The posts went viral. People began to discuss the revelations, and some even took to the streets to demand an investigation of the police. But along with the support came danger. Warren soon realized that things were taking a dangerous turn. His actions began to attract attention. People began to ask questions that had gone unanswered for too long. Warren gathered his men and gave the order. "Find that girl, whatever it takes. And if she opens her mouth again, she'll regret it." That night, Zoe sat in the basement with a few allies, going over new messages from people. One of them sent a picture, a uniformed police officer handing an envelope to a man who looked like a local official. "Is that proof?" one of her friends asked. "That's a start," Zoe replied, "but we need more." At that moment, a knock sounded on the cellar door. Everyone froze. Zoe's heart sank into her heels. She knew it could be Warren, but instead, a middle-aged woman entered the room. Her face was haggard, but there was determination in her eyes. "My name is Anna," she said, sitting down across from Zoe. "My son disappeared 2 years ago. He was an activist. I know it has something to do with Warren. If you're ready to fight, I'm ready to tell you everything I know." Zoe nodded. She could feel her spark of resistance bursting into a flame. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was the struggle of everyone the system was trying to destroy. Zoe felt the noose tightening. Every step she took was now a walk through a minefield. She knew Warren wouldn't stop until he destroyed her. But fear was no longer her companion. It had become fuel for the fight. One night, while she was hiding in an abandoned warehouse building, the door was kicked in with a deafening rumble. Several police officers rushed inside, their faces cold, devoid of emotion. Warren led the way, his expression the epitome of power and the pleasure of impending revenge. "There she is," he smirked. "Our internet star. You think you can start a revolution sitting in this filthy corner?" One of the officers came over and yanked Zoe out of her chair, throwing her to the cold concrete floor. She hit so hard that for a moment everything went dark. "You're pathetic," Warren hissed, stepping closer. "Look at you. You're nothing. Black, helpless, and you still think you can stand up to us?" He kicked her chair, which overturned with a clatter. The people who were hiding with her tried to intervene, but they were immediately grabbed and thrown out into the street. "You should have shut up," he continued, leaning toward Zoe. "And now you're about to find out what happens to those who dare to defy the system." Her arrest was a show. She was tied up like a criminal and dragged down the street. People stopped and watched, but no one intervened. Warren had deliberately chosen a route to take her through busy neighborhoods where she could be publicly humiliated. "There she is, the heroine," he shouted, pointing at her. "That's the one who says she fights for the truth. But what has she done? She broke the law. She slandered us, those who defend order." The crowd began to whisper. Someone shouted out, "Look at her. Think she's better than us." Zoe was silent. Her face was still, but inside her everything was boiling. She knew it was his game to make her look pathetic, to destroy her reputation in front of those who might support her. At the police station, the humiliation continued. She was thrown into a cold, filthy cell, taking everything she had, including her notebook. Warren personally saw to it that she was left without food or water. "Think about your mistakes here," he said before he left. "If you're smart and sign a confession, maybe I'll even let you go." Zoe didn't say anything. She knew that signing a false confession meant betraying everything she'd fought for. The next day, she was brought out for questioning. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp pointed directly at her face. Warren sat across from her, his baton resting on the table as a reminder of what would happen if she didn't cooperate. "You have one last chance," he said, holding out the paper. "You sign this, admit that everything you said was a lie, and you're free to go." Zoe looked at him and, gathering all her courage, said, "No." Warren clenched his fists. He reached up, grabbed her shoulder, and pulled her closer to him. "You think you're so brave? You think someone will marry you?" he hissed. "No one. People will forget you in a week, and I'll still be here." But at that moment, something happened that he had not expected. A young lawyer in a strict suit appeared at the door of the interrogation room. Behind him stood Anna, the woman whose son had disappeared, and several other activists. "She won't say a word without me present," the lawyer said firmly. "Also, Sergeant Warren, we have a statement you'll want to hear." Warren froze. His eyes narrowed and he left the room, leaving the lawyer alone with Zoe. Over the next few hours, her allies sprang into action. They gathered enough evidence to initiate an independent investigation. Witnesses who had previously been fearful began to come forward. The evidence began to pile up. Zoe was released under public pressure. People gathered outside the station with placards and demands to stop the persecution. Her release was met with applause, but she knew it was only the first step. That night, sitting in a safe place, Zoe felt hopeful for the first time in a long time. Now she knew she was not alone. The sparks of resistance had ignited into a flame that could consume the entire system. Warren had lost the first round, but the war was just beginning. Zoe sat in a room with low ceilings and peeling walls. Her notebook lay in front of her, and a lone lamp burned on the table. The lawyer, the activists, and a few of her new allies, including Anna, sat around her. They looked at her expectantly. Her words, her evidence, could turn things around. "We have a start," Zoe said, pulling away from her notebook. "But it's not enough. To bring Warren and his system down, We need to connect him to the people who pay him to do his dirty work. I know where to look." The first step was an ambush. One of Zoe's allies, David, had told her about a meeting that was to take place at a warehouse where Warren usually socialized with people in the criminal underworld. Zoe knew getting there would be risky, but they had a plan. They set up a hidden camera and hid in the next room. Zoe watched through the narrow slit in the door as Warren stepped inside, followed by a man in an expensive suit. Their conversation began with Warren's usual threats and taunts, but then turned to business. "You need to take these activists out," the man said. "They are already talking too much. We can't let information leak out." "For an extra fee, no problem," Warren replied, grinning. "I've got people who'll do it without anyone suspecting a thing." This conversation had become pivotal. Zoe now had proof that Warren worked not only as a corrupt police officer, but also as a mercenary for criminal gangs that profited from chaos and intimidation. But that was just the beginning. Zoe began connecting the dots: buildings seized by developers, companies that had contracts with the city, disappearances of activists. Everything pointed to a web of corruption in which Warren was just one of the tools. She decided to take a chance and contact a journalist from a major publication. The journalist she met in a secluded cafe was skeptical, but when she handed him the notes, his face changed. "If it's true," he said, "it's not just a local scandal. It will destroy a lot of people's careers." The next day, the piece was published. The headline read, "System of Fear: How the Police Cooperate with Criminal Gangs to Repress Citizens." The article included records, photographs, and testimonies. Warren's name appeared at the center, and his connections to major businessmen and officials were mentioned. The internet exploded. People began demanding answers, and a wave of protests swept the city. But instead of backing down, the system struck back. Warren and his colleagues began actively pursuing anyone connected to the exposé. Anna's house was set on fire, but she and her family managed to escape. One activist was severely beaten, and David went missing. Zoe had become public enemy number one. Her face was all over the screens with new accusations. She was now called not only a criminal, but also a conspirator, allegedly working for outside forces to destroy order. One evening, as Zoe tried to take a break in the shelter, she heard a noise outside. Her heart twitched. It could have been an ambush. She turned off the light and stood still, listening. There was a knock at the door. Quietly at first, then insistently. "Zoe, it's me," came a familiar voice. It was a lawyer. She carefully opened the door and he ran inside, closing the lock behind him. "We're in trouble," he said, breathing heavily. "They've started a sweep. Warren is out of control. We have to speed up or we'll just get wiped out." "What have we got?" Zoe asked, trying to hold on. "Enough to trigger a federal investigation," he replied. "But we need more to stop them from destroying the evidence." Zoe and her team began to act with redoubled vigor. They searched for new evidence, recruited people who were afraid to talk, and organized new media leaks. Each article, each video increased the pressure on the system. Soon, the Federal Bureau announced that it was launching an investigation. It was the beginning of the end for Warren and his allies. But Zoe knew their resistance would become even fiercer. The last time she'd seen Warren, it had been at a rally. He was standing on the other side of the square, surrounded by his men. His gaze met hers, and a smirk played across his face. He wasn't broken, not yet. But Zoe knew the truth had already come out. She had an army of allies now, and the system built on fear was beginning to crack. There was only one thing left for her to do: keep fighting until they finally fell. Zoe felt the walls of her world crumbling one by one. Every day the fight against the system became more and more dangerous. Enemies were closing in, and allies were becoming fewer and fewer. But she couldn't stop. Every day she saw the results of her labor, small sparks of resistance flaring up in the heart of the city. Her perseverance inspired others, even if it cost her almost everything. At dawn, she was informed David was missing. His trail had cut off in the street outside the warehouse where he kept his records. Zoe knew it was Warren's work. For days she tried unsuccessfully to find him, but soon the news came. David's body had been found in the river. His death was presented as an accident. Zoe couldn't hold back the tears. He'd been one of the first to believe in her, who'd supported her when she'd first started this fight. Now he was a victim, and she felt the blame for that rested on her shoulders. "It's all because of me," she whispered, sitting in the corner of the abandoned room. "No," Anna answered firmly. "It's because of them. It's their fear of you, of us. But if you stop now, his death will be in vain." Those words were Zoe's salvation. She realized that her pain was not the end. It was the fuel for her struggle. Soon, the next blow came. One of the activists, a young guy named Thomas, was arrested. He was accused of drug possession, a standard trick of the system to destroy the reputation of its enemies. Thomas hadn't been seen for days, and Zoe knew he had probably been tortured to make him give up the fight. She tried to contact the lawyer, but he too was targeted. His office was burned down, and the lawyer was beaten and forced to temporarily leave the city. "They're building up the pressure," Anna said, looking at the group of remaining activists. "But we have to keep going." Zoe had to go into hiding. She moved from place to place every night. Her hiding places became less and less safe. Sometimes she slept in abandoned cars or in the basements of ruined houses. Her body was exhausted, but her spirit remained strong. Every night, she opened her notebook and wrote down everything she could remember about her enemies. Her notes became more and more detailed. She was trying to put together a complete portrait of the system she was fighting against, so that no one else would be able to deny its existence. Despite the pressure, the resistance was gaining strength. Hundreds of posts with hashtags in support of Zoya appeared on social networks. People began to take to the streets demanding investigations. They shouted her name, and every cry echoed in her heart as a reminder that she was not alone. In one of the videos taken at the protest, a woman held up a placard that read, "We are all Zoe." These words have become a symbol of resistance. But, along with the support, the danger grew. One night, Zoe heard the loud sound of breaking glass. She looked out the window of her temporary shelter and saw several men in police uniforms setting fire to a neighboring house. It was a warning. She knew her loved ones had become targets. Anna was forced to flee the city after her house was burned to the ground. Other activists were threatened as well. Zoe had no one left whom she could trust. But in that darkest moment, something incredible happened. At one of the activists' meetings, a man she had never seen before appeared. He was a former police officer who had left because of corruption. "My name is Michael," he said, looking directly at Zoe. "I saw what you were doing, and I'm here to help. I have the names, the documents, and the evidence you're looking for." Zoe looked at him in disbelief, but her allies confirmed his story. Michael was proven to be a valuable resource. He gave her records of Warren's meetings with criminal leaders, documents proving bribes, and even audio recordings of conversations that included the names of high-ranking officials. These materials became Zoya's new weapon. She began to publish them through anonymous channels, and each leak caused a public uproar. Officials who had previously denied any connection to corruption began to resign. The system began to crack, but its resistance grew fiercer. One day, as Zoe sat in the shelter, a girl of about 16 approached her. "I saw your video," she said. "You inspired me. I want to help." Zoe felt a warmth in her heart. Her struggle was no longer personal. She had become a symbol for others. People began to unite, inspired by her resilience. At that moment, she realized the price of her struggle was high. She had lost friends, loved ones, a home, but she had gained more. Hope. Hope that the world could change. Hope that her struggle was not in vain. And now, even in her darkest moments, she knew that the fire of resistance continued to burn. And that fire was not just hers. It belonged to everyone who believed in justice. The sky over the city was gray, as if it itself shared the tension of the coming events. Crowds of protesters crowded the main streets, chanting, "We are all Zoe." Banners, posters, and loudspeakers screamed for justice. It seemed the whole city had finally decided it would not stand for any more. Zoe stood in the center of this storm. She was exhausted, with circles under her eyes and a weakened body, but determination blazed in her gaze. This was the finale. She could feel it. The final blow to the system remained, and it had to be precise. Together with Michael, a former officer, and other activists, Zoe gathered all the evidence: audio recordings, documents, photos. They decided to publish them simultaneously through several major media outlets and social networks. This information contained everything: bribes, illegal deals, evidence of Warren and his team's links with criminal groups, as well as evidence of torture and murder of activists. But the main trump card was a videotape of Warren himself, unaware that he was being recorded, confessing to his crimes. "We control this city," he said on the tape. "These people, they're nobodies. They should be afraid of us. If they start asking questions, we take them out. It's simple." When that tape went live, the city exploded. The crowds in the streets doubled in size. People demanded immediate action, and for the first time in the entire struggle, Zoe had the feeling that the system was shaking. But Warren wasn't about to give up. He gathered his team and tried to destroy the last piece of evidence. One of the activists' bases, where copies of documents were stored, was attacked. The people there were beaten, and the equipment was destroyed. Michael was injured but managed to escape with some of the files. "They're desperately clinging to power," he said as he turned back to Zoe. "This is their end, but they'll do anything to take as much as they can with them." Zoe knew that now everything depended on the last step. They decided to turn over any remaining evidence to the federal investigators who had begun their investigation after the first wave of leaks. When Zoe was on her way with Michael and Anna to a meeting with federal officials, they were attacked. Police officers in civilian clothes blocked the road, pulling them out of the car. Zoe screamed as she was roughly thrown to the ground. "You think you've won?" Warren hissed, leaning over her. "You won't win anything. This town will always be mine." But he underestimated her. Michael managed to transfer some of the files through the secure network, and at that moment the federal agents were already approaching them. On the same day, police under Warren's leadership attempted to disperse protesters by force. People were beaten, arrested, and tear gas was used. But something changed. The crowd didn't back down. People began to fight back. They stood up again and again, raising placards and shouting the names of those who had died. It was more than a protest. It was an uprising. Federal agents arrived in town with a warrant for the arrest of Warren and several other key figures. When they arrived at the police station, Warren tried to escape. He ran out the back exit, but was stopped. It was the protesters. They stood in a wall, not allowing him to pass. He shouted, threatened, but the people were silent. They just stood there looking at him. It was the final admission of his powerlessness. Within days, not only Warren but several officials who worked with him were arrested. The federal investigation continued, and every day new details emerged about a system built on fear, corruption, and violence. Zoe could finally breathe freely. Her name was now known not only in her town, but beyond. People called her a symbol of resistance, even though she herself believed it wasn't her victory. It was the victory of all those who stood with her, even if they were no longer with her. A few weeks later, Zoe spoke at the first rally after Warren's arrest. She sat in her new wheelchair, looking out at the thousands of people who had come to hear her. "This fight has not been easy," she said, her voice quiet but confident. "We have lost too much, but we have shown that even the darkest system can be destroyed if we unite. This fight isn't over, but we know now that we have power." The crowd erupted in applause. People shouted her name. Zoe raised her hand, and in that moment she felt that her struggle had not been in vain. She was the beginning of a new era, where no one would be afraid to fight for justice anymore. The city was gradually changing. Old buildings that were symbols of corruption were being demolished to build something new. People began to believe in their own strength. Although the road to justice was still long, Zoe knew it was now open, and somewhere in the back of her mind she realized this was only the first step. What do you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you or a loved one experienced something similar? Have you experienced injustice or racism? Your stories are important to us, and we appreciate everyone who chooses to share their experiences. If this story made you emotional, please give us a like and subscribe so we don't miss out on more thought-provoking stories. Your support inspires us to create more stories like this. Have a good day. May your day be filled with light, warmth, and justice. Thank you for being with us.